Hi, BookTube, and welcome to another fiction review. When I think about the novels that I've read, and I'm talking about realism, novels that use realism, they're not fantasy or sci-fi, it seems to me that those kind of novels can be divided into two categories. All novels focus on their characters, but some stories feel cozier. If I said they kind of had walls around them, would that make sense? You get to know the characters and their immediate world, but that's the full scope of the narration. The novel doesn't portray them as part of something larger. Okay? Now, the novel we're going to look at today is in the second category. You, yes, are still focused on the personal stories of the characters, but these stories have a broader context. And because of that context, the characters, they are more than just individuals. They take on sometimes symbolic properties, and they're really vehicles for telling a bigger story. The story of a family, a time in history, a movement, or a nation. Think of examples like Zadie Smith's White Teeth, Charles Dickens' Bleak House, or Tolstoy's War and Peace. They're good examples of that kind of bigger story where you cannot isolate the drama of the characters' lives from the drama of the history that they live through, the history to which they contribute their small part. Today we are reviewing Half of a Yellow Sun by Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, published in 2006 by Harper Perennial. Can I pitch this novel? This novel follows the lives of twin sisters and their families, and how they all experienced the 1966 Igbo pogrom, the secession of East Nigeria to form the independent state of Biafra, and the 3-year civil war and blockade from the inside. The full character list extends across ethnic and social groups in Nigeria. It portrays life in the cities and in the villages, and it touches, yes, mainly those on the inside in the state of Biafra, but also some who are outside the conflict and looking in. And as I mentioned in the opening, the characters can be appreciated, yes, for the interpersonal dramas that happen between them, but as much so, and perhaps more importantly, they are examples of lives lived through an ordeal, which produced the second highest number of deaths of any conflict on the African continent. The book details: how long is it, how did I get it, how much did it cost? Well, my Harper paperback had 431 pages of text in a rather small font. I was going to say 9-point, and this one structural detail is probably why this particular book, which was one of the 12 titles I put on my Read What You Own TBR list, has waited until now for me to crack it open. I was just a little bit intimidated by that tiny font. I thought it seemed to make the book longer, but that was my loss, it turns out, because I found when I opened it that this novel has an incredibly strong pull. Incredibly strong. The pages got read, and somehow I didn't perceive them going by. I didn't perceive how quickly I was reading. I bought my copy secondhand for £1.50. Don't remember where. Amazon.co.uk and eBay have plenty of reasonably priced copies. The Kindle ebook is £4.99 in the UK. However, in the US, it's $11.99, which is more expensive than the paperback. Now, US readers, you've got to explain this to me. That seems unreasonable. But anyway, the better deal, I think, unless you're looking for something collectible or you need to have an ebook, the best deal is a recycled paperback. And now, a short word about the author. Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie was born in Nigeria in 1977, and she grew up on the campus of the University of Nigeria in Nsukka because her father was a professor there and her mother was the first registrar. She completed her higher education in the United States at Eastern Connecticut State University, graduating with a degree in communications and political science. At the same time she was writing articles for the university newspaper, she also published a play at that time about the Biafran conflict under the name Amanda Adichie. Now, Amanda is actually the author's given name, to which she later added the prefix chi to conform with Igbo Christian naming customs. She continued in academia. She earned a master's in creative writing from Johns Hopkins University. She earned a fellowship from Princeton to study introductory fiction, and she has a second master's degree in African Studies from Yale University. The manuscript for her first novel, Purple Hibiscus, struggled for acceptance with American publishers because, and here we go, they suggested Adichie should change the setting from Africa to America to achieve a broader appeal with readers. Thankfully, she had assistance from a literary agent who put her in touch with the independent publisher Fourth Estate. Half of a Yellow Sun took Adichie 4 years of research and writing to complete. The book won the Orange Prize for Fiction in 2007, which was the same year it came out in the United Kingdom, and it also won the International Nonino Prize in 2009 and the Anisfield Wolf Book Award the same year. In a 2023 interview that she gave to Atlantic magazine, Adichie did hint that she was working on another novel. Now, I would be really thrilled to know more details of that book, so if anybody knows more about that, please feel free to leave a comment. This book is set in several different locations within the former state of Biafra, which you can see here is on the southeast coast of Nigeria. And what you experience as you read is the economic and social disintegration of that state, the increased isolation felt by the characters because there are blockades on the supply of food and other essentials like soap. And then there is the uncertainty because the truth is often withheld or misrepresented over the mass media by the government, the usual propaganda drive that happens in all countries to try to maintain order and morale during a war. What makes this book so engrossing, and the reason that I hardly noticed how quickly I was getting through it, even with that small font text, was seeing how the changes had such different effects on the characters. This setting, it is a revealer of character. The historical event is an acid test of character that strips away any pretense, any privilege. And what was interesting was to see which characters who maybe didn't seem to have as much to lose changed more, felt the loss more. And then there were others which remained pretty much the same before and during the conflict. It was very interesting to see which of those was which. And this is a picture of the Biafran flag showing half of a yellow sun. The novel, its narration is third-person omniscient, and the character focus usually remains with one character throughout a chapter. That is, Adichie seems to use her chapter breaks as a way of shifting the reader's perspective from one character's view of things to another. And there are also time shifts in this novel. You begin in the early 60s. I'm not 100% sure of the year. Could be 63, 64. At any rate, before the war, so that you can be introduced to the characters and the way their lives are lived in peace. Then it moves forward to 1966-67 when the crisis begins. Then it moves back again to the pre-war period, but to events that you weren't aware of. And then finally it returns to 1967 and you remain with the characters until the cessation of hostilities in 1970. These shifts in viewpoint and in time, I think they achieve something like the effect that Adichie championed in her 2009 TED Talk, which was called The Danger of a Single Story. I'm going to leave a link to that YouTube video in my description box, but just to summarize, Adichie talked about the dangerous way that we all have of accepting simplified single stories about groups or categories of people. And she notes how these stories are often told by groups of people who are culturally dominant about groups of people who are not. And the stories constitute an exercise of power over the less dominant group. They reduce the true complexity of the people and the possibility that there might actually be much in common, particularly strengths in common with people in the dominant group. And I think Adichie creates multiple viewpoints and time shifts to ensure that we get the fullest possible stories about her characters. Does this novel fit a genre label? Everything depends on which of the principal characters you focus on, because they all have different stories. If we think, for example, of Ugwu, the houseboy, who begins the novel at the age of 12 or 13 and he ends it at 17 or 18, this is a coming-of-age story. For Olana, on the other hand, it's a survivor story, which is ironic when you consider it against the fate of her tougher twin sister. For Richard Churchill, it's the account of an observer who tries and fails to write a book about what he observes and understands in the end that the observer is never the best person to tell the story. What, if anything, stands out as an aspect of this book or the author? I think the author deserves great praise here. Adichie is an amazing Storyteller. And there's something about a really good storyteller. They can take you to a place you hardly understand, and they can hold you there. And Adichie does this. I was 3 years old when the Biafran War started. I have been to some very nice tourist destinations in South Africa, and that's my total experience of the African continent. And yet, there was no problem with this book. Adichie could take me to places where I thought I have no idea where I am, and yet I was there, felt fully there, and was gripped by the book all the way through. In her TED Talk, Adichie talks about her childhood reading British and American children's books, right, where the characters are white and they play in snow, and they talk about the weather and they drink ginger beer. And all these things, of course, were mysteries to her as a young Nigerian, but the power of the story was still enough to fire her imagination, so much that the first story she wrote, she says at age 7, had white characters who played in the snow and drank ginger beer. Okay, she thankfully learned that African children and African adults can appear in stories as themselves, and she created a character like Ugwu, who was familiar to her but very new to me. Nevertheless, so well portrayed that he fired my imagination. And it's funny, this is a bit of an aside, but I've been watching many of the recent BookTube videos discussing gendered reading and why some men are not reading books written by women. And I think we can employ Adichie's principle from her TED Talk to this problem. That is, the less we read of stories that come from other groups of people, the more we can then allow ourselves to instead believe a single story about them, a single story that is usually dull and one-dimensional. So if you choose not to read women authors, then what you are ensuring, it's an exercise of power on your part, and what you are ensuring is that you will never grow beyond a story of women that is one-dimensional and dull, and unfortunately also will be completely incorrect. And the same is true if one chooses not to read authors from different backgrounds or identities. Is there problematic content in this book? Yes. There are descriptions of murders, physical and verbal abuse, sexual assaults, sexual threat, descriptions of the effects of malnutrition and the deaths of children. It's possible that I've forgotten something in that list, but if you feel okay to handle what I've already mentioned, then you should be okay with anything I've left out. The context of the problematic content: war is war. And this is, even though I say that, an essentially positive novel. There is a scene shortly after peace is declared where Olana, one of the twin sisters, recognizes a cousin that she hasn't been able to see for several years because of the fighting. So she runs up to him, and when she asks, "How have you been, brother?" he replies, "We did not die." The book has a sad ending, but it's also a resilient one. The characters, you know that they're never going to forget what they suffered, but at the same time, they are also going to make what they can of the life that they somehow managed not to lose. Any suggestions for related or follow-up reading? Adichie gave an interview to the Guardian newspaper, and she mentioned how she loved a series of books when she was younger called Pacesetters. I'm going to put an example cover of one book up on screen. They were a series of low-cost paperbacks that were published by Macmillan between 1977 and 1988. They were all written by African authors, mostly Nigerian, but also some Ghanaian, Kenyan, and South African. Adichie credits them with helping her develop a pan-African sensibility. They've been out of print since the 1990s, and if you try looking for hardcover, not hardcover, but hard copy editions, they are expensive. Now, there is a website called PacesettersNovels.com, and it appears to be one individual's efforts to create ebook versions of these novels, which sell for a more reasonable £12 sterling or $12 US. They don't have all 130 titles, sadly, but I think this is a valiant attempt to preserve some vintage fiction, and so that's my recommendation, and I'm going to put their website in my description box. And that's another fiction review done. Believe it or not, I am just 5 weeks away from being able to buy books again. Very exciting. And I'm pleased to say that I've finished 11 of the 12 books that I set as a TBR list last year for this challenge. Half of A Yellow Sun was number 11 of 12. Book number 12 is nonfiction. I'm reading it right now, and it ties in really well with Adichie's book. I didn't plan to read them together, but I'm really glad it worked out that way. Now, for my next fiction read, that is another short story collection. I own far more of these than I realized, which is not a complaint. This one is the debut work of an author who didn't begin her writing career until she was 70 years old. I hope your September reading is going well, and I'll be back at the weekend with more content. Until then, take care, everybody. Bye-bye.